The first time I heard the voice of the mountain, I was 7 years old and dying of fever in my grandfather's stone hut at 14,000 feet. The wind screamed outside with a fury that made the walls shake, and inside my small body burned with infection that no medicine could touch. My grandfather, the village shaman, sat beside me chanting prayers that seemed to fade into the storm rather than rise above it. Then the chanting stopped. The wind stopped. And in that impossible silence, I heard it. Not words exactly, not sound in the way humans understand sound, but communication that bypassed my ears entirely and resonated in my bones, in my blood, in some ancient part of my brain that remembered what it was like before language, before civilization, before humans forgot how to listen to voices that weren't human. Asterisk, the child will live. The child will learn. The child will carry what must be carried. Asterisk. My name is Tenzing Norbu, and I am 83 years old. I have been the shaman of my village in the Khumbu Valley for 60 years, following my grandfather and his grandfather before him, maintaining traditions that stretch back centuries before Nepal was a nation, before the British came to measure our mountains, before anyone thought to call Komalungma by the foreign name Everest. And for 56 years, since I was 27 and newly appointed to my grandfather's role, I have known the Yeti. Not as legend, not as myth, not as the monster that tourists come seeking with their cameras and their certainty that anything unknown must be dangerous, but as teacher, as guardian, as the keeper of secrets that humanity desperately needs to hear but refuses to listen to. The secret about climate, about what's happening to our world, about what's coming, about why the Yeti watches and waits and knows that time is running out. That secret was revealed to me gradually over decades. But the full truth, the devastating truth, the truth that will sound like madness to anyone who hasn't spent their life listening to voices that aren't human, that came only 3 months ago. And it changed everything I thought I understood about time, about consciousness, about the relationship between thought and reality, about what it means when an entire species can feel the planet dying and knows exactly when and how it will end. This is that story. This is my testimony. This is the warning that the Yeti has been trying to give humanity for generations, filtered through the only human who could hear it, who would listen, who understood that some truths are too important to dismiss just because they challenge everything we think we know. The fever broke that night when I was 7. My grandfather said I'd been given a gift, that the mountain spirits had chosen me as they'd chosen him, that I would carry visions and voices that others couldn't perceive. I didn't understand then. Thought it was just the delirium of sickness, the metaphors that adults use to explain the inexplicable to children. But 3 weeks later, I saw my first Yeti, and I understood that the voice I'd heard wasn't metaphor or fever dream or spiritual abstraction. It was him. It had always been him. The guardian of the high places, the watcher of the eternal snows, the being that existed in the space between legend and reality, between animal and person, between the world as humans understand it and the world as it actually is. What this shaman discovers about the Yeti and climate will fundamentally challenge your understanding of reality itself. Subscribe now and hit that notification bell. This story reveals truths that science is only beginning to comprehend. He was standing on a ridge above our village, silhouetted against the dawn sky, watching, just watching. And when our eyes met across that distance, the voice came again, clearer this time, stronger. You will learn to listen. You will learn to see. You will learn to carry what others cannot bear. I was 7 years old. I should have been terrified, but I felt only recognition, as if some part of me had always known he was there, had always been waiting for this moment, had always understood that my life would be shaped by this relationship between human and something that wasn't quite human, but was undeniably, profoundly real. My grandfather saw my expression and followed my gaze. He couldn't see the Yeti. Most people can't, even when they're looking directly at him. He's mastered the art of being invisible in plain sight, of existing just outside the frequency of normal human perception. But my grandfather knew what I was seeing from my face, from my stillness, from the way the air had changed. "Ah," he said simply, "so it begins. He has chosen you, as he chose me, as he chose my grandfather. You will walk between worlds now, little one. You will hear what others cannot hear, see what others cannot see, know what others refuse to know. It is a hard path, but it is your path." I didn't understand. Not then. But over the next 76 years, I came to understand everything. And the understanding has been exactly as hard as my grandfather warned, exactly as necessary as the Yeti insisted, exactly as urgent as the dying planet requires. My formal training began when I turned 12. My grandfather took me higher into the mountains than I'd ever been, to places where the air was so thin that every breath felt insufficient, where the cold cut through layers of wool and leather like they were nothing, where the silence was so complete it felt like the world itself was holding its breath. The Yeti does not live where humans live, my grandfather explained as we climbed. He exists in the spaces between earth and sky, between waking and dreaming, between the physical and the spiritual. To meet him properly, to learn from him, you must learn to exist in those spaces too. The training was brutal. Days of fasting, nights of exposure to cold that should have killed me, hours of meditation in positions that made my muscles scream and my joints crack. My grandfather pushed me to the edges of what human consciousness could endure, teaching me to separate my awareness from my body, to perceive without the limitations of physical senses, to listen to frequencies that normal human ears couldn't detect. And gradually, over months and then years, I learned to hear the mountain's voice not just in crisis moments, but constantly, like a radio station that was always broadcasting if you knew how to tune in. Learned to see things that existed just outside normal perception, energy patterns, emotional resonances, the subtle movements of beings that had mastered the art of being invisible. Learned to communicate with the Yeti. Our first real conversation happened when I was 15. I'd been sent alone on a vision quest, 3 days and nights in a high cave with no food, no fire, no comfort except the certainty that this was necessary, that this was how shamans had always been made, that suffering was the price of perception. On the third night, when I was hallucinating from hunger and cold and exhaustion, when the line between waking and dreaming had blurred into meaninglessness, he appeared. Not physically, he was miles away, safe in his own territory, but in my mind, in my consciousness, in that space between thoughts where communication happens without words. And he showed me things, not through images or language, but through direct experience, through feelings and knowings that bypassed my brain entirely and imprinted themselves on my consciousness like memories I'd always had but forgotten. He showed me the mountains as they'd been thousands of years ago, when his people had been numerous and had walked freely across territories that stretched from Tibet to Bhutan. He showed me the slow decline of his species, not through violence primarily, though there had been violence, but through something more insidious, the gradual transformation of the world into something they couldn't survive in, something that no longer had space for beings like them. He showed me humans arriving, multiplying, spreading like a tide that never receded. Showed me how we changed everything we touched, how we transformed wild places into managed spaces, how we brought with us concepts of ownership and boundaries and control that were fundamentally incompatible with his people's way of being. And he showed me something else. Something I didn't understand then, but have spent the decades since trying to comprehend, trying to translate into terms that human minds can grasp. He showed me that his people felt the planet. Not metaphorically, not spiritually, but literally. They were connected to the Earth's systems in ways that made them sensitive to changes that humans with all our instruments and measurements couldn't detect. They felt the planet's health the way humans feel their own body's health. Intimately, immediately, undeniably. And they knew something was wrong. Had known for generations, for centuries, for longer than humans had been keeping records. The planet was sick and getting sicker, and his people could feel it dying with a certainty that went beyond data or projections or scientific models. They could feel it because they were part of it in ways humans had forgotten how to be. And that connection, that sensitivity, was killing them as surely as any weapon. When the vision ended, when I came back to my cold cave and my hungry body and my physical existence, I understood why the Yeti had chosen me. Someone needed to hear what he knew. Someone needed to translate his knowing into terms that humans might understand. Someone needed to carry the warning that his people had been screaming at humanity for generations, but no one had been listening to. That someone was me. I became the village shaman when I was 27, after my grandfather died in his sleep at the age of 96. The villagers came to me for healing, for guidance, for the rituals that connected our community to the larger patterns of existence. I performed those duties with the seriousness they deserved, maintaining traditions that had sustained our people through centuries of hardship. But my real work, my secret work, was with the Yeti. 3 times a month, I would climb into the high places where he lived, carrying offerings of food and salt, and sometimes books. Yes, books, because despite having no written language of his own, he was fascinated by human attempts to capture knowledge in symbols, by our need to write down what we feared we'd forget. We developed a sophisticated form of communication over the years. Not language exactly, but something more direct, a sharing of consciousness that let us exchange concepts and experiences and understandings that words would have diluted or distorted. When we communicated, I could feel what he felt, see what he saw, know what he knew with a certainty that no explanation could have provided. And month by month, year by year, he taught me to feel what his people felt, taught me to perceive the planet's systems not as abstractions, but as living, interconnected patterns, taught me to sense the subtle wrongness that was growing, spreading, becoming more pronounced with each passing season. What the Yeti reveals about Earth's climate systems will shock you. Stay subscribed. The connection between consciousness and planetary health is more real and more terrifying than you can imagine. The first clear warning came in 1985, when I was 44 and had been working with the Yeti for 17 years. That winter was wrong. Not just colder or warmer than normal, but fundamentally off in ways that instruments couldn't measure, but living things could feel. The snow fell in patterns that made no sense. The wind blew from directions it shouldn't have. The wildlife behaved erratically, animals appearing in wrong seasons, plants blooming at wrong times, the whole intricate dance of nature stumbling over itself in confusion. The Yeti showed me why. Through our connection, he let me feel what he felt, the planet's regulatory systems struggling, overcompensating, beginning to fail in ways that would cascade into larger failures. The atmosphere wasn't just warming, it was destabilizing, losing the subtle equilibriums that had maintained relative stability for thousands of years. He showed me patterns that would take human scientists another decade to begin documenting. Showed me the jet stream fragmenting, the ocean currents shifting, the feedback loops beginning to trigger that would accelerate changes beyond any human ability to control. And he showed me the cause, not through blame or judgment, but through simple observation. Human activity had exceeded the planet's capacity to absorb and process. We had taken a system that was resilient within certain parameters and pushed it beyond those parameters into territory where resilience broke down, where small changes triggered massive responses, where the entire system began lurching toward new equilibriums that would be catastrophic for most existing life. His people had watched this happening for generations, had felt it in their bones, in their blood, in the deep connection they maintained with planetary systems. And they'd been trying to warn anyone who would listen, appearing to shamans and mystics and anyone sensitive enough to perceive them, trying to communicate the urgency of what was coming. But humans weren't listening, weren't looking, were too busy measuring and abstracting and building models to notice the direct evidence that was available to anyone who learned to feel rather than just think. I tried to warn people, told my village that changes were coming, that the old patterns were breaking down, that we needed to prepare for a world that would be fundamentally different from the one our ancestors had known. Some listened, most didn't. And the ones who did listen couldn't really grasp the scope of what I was trying to communicate, couldn't understand that this wasn't just about having harder winters or longer droughts, but about the entire planetary system entering a new and dangerous phase. The Yeti watched my efforts with what I came to recognize as sadness. He'd seen this pattern before, sensitive individuals trying to warn their communities, being dismissed or ignored or labeled crazy, watching helplessly as the catastrophe they predicted unfolded exactly as they'd foreseen. His people had tried, had spent centuries trying, and it hadn't been enough. Because humans required proof in forms we could measure, and by the time the proof was measurable, it would be too late to prevent the worst of what was coming. The 1990s brought changes that even non-sensitive people began noticing. Glaciers retreating at visible rates, weather patterns becoming more erratic, growing seasons shifting. The mountain itself felt different, less stable, more prone to avalanches and rockfalls, as if the permafrost that had held it together for millennia was loosening its grip. The Yeti's communication became more urgent during this decade. Our meetings increased from 3 times a month to weekly, sometimes more. He was aging now. I could see it in the gray spreading through his fur, in the way he moved with less fluidity than before. But his urgency had nothing to do with his own mortality and everything to do with what he was feeling from the planet. Through our connection, he showed me something that human climate science was only beginning to understand: tipping points. Thresholds beyond which changes became self-reinforcing, where warming triggered releases of carbon that triggered more warming, where ice melt reduced reflectivity that accelerated melt, where feedback loops cascaded into accelerating spirals that no amount of human intervention could slow or reverse. And he showed me that some of those tipping points had already been crossed, not in the future, not as predictions or possibilities, but in the past. Already done, already irreversible. The planet was now committed to changes that would unfold over decades and centuries, regardless of what humans did going forward. This was the secret that would sound like despair if I spoke it aloud. This was the knowing that his people carried, that the catastrophe wasn't coming. It had already begun, was already locked in, was already inevitable in its broad strokes, even if the details remained uncertain. But it wasn't despair. The Yeti didn't communicate despair. Instead, what he shared was something more complex. Acceptance mixed with urgency. Recognition that some futures were lost, but others remained possible. Understanding that even if the worst couldn't be prevented, the difference between very bad and civilization endings still mattered immensely. He showed me 2 paths humanity could take, not through imagery, but through felt experience, through the emotional and physical reality of what each path would mean. The first path, continue as we were going, deny or minimize or simply fail to act with sufficient speed and scale. In this path, the planetary systems would continue destabilizing until they reached points of no return, triggering changes so extreme that human civilization as currently organized would not survive. Not extinction. Humans are too adaptable for that. But collapse, fragmentation, centuries or millennia of suffering as we learn to survive in a world we'd made hostile to our own existence. The second path, radical transformation. Immediate, comprehensive changes to how humans organized ourselves, how we related to the planet, how we understood our place in the larger web of life. Changes that seemed impossible given human nature and human systems, but that remained technically possible if we could find the will and wisdom to implement them. The Yeti didn't have hope that humans would choose the second path. Hope wasn't part of his cognitive framework. He dealt in observation and probability and the patterns he'd seen repeat throughout his long existence. And the patterns suggested that humans always chose short-term comfort over long-term survival, always prioritized individual benefit over collective well-being, always delayed action until crisis forced it upon them. By which point, for this particular crisis, it would be far too late. Carrying this knowledge changed me in ways that isolated me even from my own community. I was the shaman, yes, the spiritual leader, the one people came to for guidance. But I was also the one who knew too much, who saw too clearly, who couldn't pretend that everything would be fine if we just maintained our traditions and prayed to the right spirits. I had a wife once, Pimba, beautiful and kind, who married me when I was 30 and she was 25. We had 3 children together, raised them in the traditional ways, taught them the old stories and the old rituals. But the knowledge I carried created a distance between us that grew wider with each passing year. How do you make love to someone when you can feel the planet dying? How do you celebrate your children's births when you know the world they're inheriting is unraveling? How do you perform ceremonies that promise continuity and renewal when you know that the future will look nothing like the past? Pemba left me when I was 52. Took our youngest child, who was still living at home, and moved to her sister's village 3 valleys over. She didn't say it was because I'd become impossible to live with, because I spent more time with the Yeti than with my family, because I was always distracted by visions and knowings that I couldn't fully explain. But we both understood. My 2 older children stopped visiting, started families of their own, built lives that didn't include a father who was increasingly seen as strange, obsessive, possibly unstable. I didn't blame them. How could I? They were trying to build normal lives in a world that was ending, and my presence was a constant reminder that normal was an illusion they were better off believing in. The truth about climate consciousness goes deeper than you can imagine. Make sure you're subscribed. What's revealed about the connection between the Yeti and planetary systems will change how you understand reality itself. The Yeti became my only real companion, the only being who understood what I was carrying, because he was carrying the same thing. We spent hours in silent communion, feeling together the slow unraveling of systems that had sustained life for millions of years, witnessing together the acceleration of changes that no individual or species could stop. He showed me that his people had always played a role in maintaining planetary balance, not through any action or intervention, but simply through their existence, through their deep connection to Earth systems, through their function as what I would call consciousness nodes, beings whose awareness and sensitivity helped regulate the larger patterns they were part of. As his species died out, as the Yeti became the last of his kind, that regulatory function was being lost, and the planet could feel that loss, responded to it, became less stable without the network of consciousness that had helped maintain equilibrium for so long. It was a chicken and egg problem. The planet's destabilization was killing his people, and his people's death was contributing to further destabilization. A feedback loop of loss and decline that was accelerating toward a point where the entire system would reorganize around new parameters. Parameters that wouldn't include beings like him, or possibly beings like us. I asked him once, through our connection, why he kept trying. Why he bothered to maintain contact with me, to share his knowledge, to warn a species that had proven incapable of listening or acting on warnings. Why not just retreat into isolation, spend his remaining years in peace rather than in the anguish of watching and knowing and being unable to change the outcome? His response was immediate and clear, because consciousness mattered, because being witnessed mattered, because even if humans couldn't or wouldn't change course, someone needed to know what was happening, needed to understand what was being lost, needed to carry the memory forward into whatever future emerged from the present catastrophe. He was teaching me not to save the world. That possibility was already lost, but to understand it deeply enough that something of value might persist through the transition. Knowledge, perspective, the wisdom that comes from seeing clearly even when seeing clearly offers no comfort. I was 68 years old when I finally accepted that this was my role. Not prophet, not savior, not the one who would change humanity's course. Just witness, carrier of uncomfortable truths, translator between species, between ways of knowing, between the world as humans preferred to imagine it and the world as it actually was. It was a lonely role, but it was necessary. And the Yeti's presence, his patient teaching, his willingness to share his knowing even when sharing brought no benefit, that made the loneliness bearable. We were both witnesses to ending, to the end of his species, to the end of planetary stability as humans had known it, to the end of comfortable assumptions about continuity and permanence. And we witnessed it together, which somehow made the unbearable slightly less so. The first decade of the 2000s brought changes that could no longer be dismissed or denied, even by the most stubborn skeptics. The glaciers that had defined our mountains for millennia retreated at rates visible year to year. Lakes appeared where there had been only ice. Rock slides and avalanches increased in frequency as the permafrost holding the mountains together melted. Our village, my village, though I'd become more shadow than member of the community, had to relocate twice in 10 years as water sources dried up and landslides threatened. The old patterns of planting and harvest stopped working. Animals appeared at wrong altitudes, in wrong seasons, their behavior erratic and confused. The Yeti showed me that this was just the beginning. The surface symptoms of deeper systemic breakdown that would continue accelerating for decades, for centuries, for as long as the feedback loops remained active and reinforcing. Through our connection, he gave me something precious and terrible, the ability to feel time differently. Not human time, measured in days and years and lifetimes, but planetary time, measured in epochs and equilibriums and the vast slow patterns that governed climate and ecosystems. From that perspective, what was happening wasn't sudden or surprising. It was inevitable consequence of pushing a system beyond its resilience thresholds. The planet wasn't dying. It was transforming, reorganizing, finding new equilibriums that would persist for thousands or millions of years after human civilization had ended or evolved into something unrecognizable. But from human perspective, from the perspective of beings who lived decades, not millennia, who needed stable climates to grow food and maintain societies, it was catastrophe. Rapid, accelerating, unsurvivable by billions of people who were already alive and committed to futures that wouldn't exist. The Yeti felt both perspectives simultaneously. Felt the planet's indifference, not cruelty, just physics and chemistry following their natural progressions. And felt the human tragedy. Billions of conscious beings who would suffer and die because their species had been too clever for its own good, too capable of changing systems it didn't understand, too focused on immediate gain to consider long-term consequences. He showed me specific timelines. Not predictions exactly. The chaotic nature of climate systems made precise prediction impossible. But probability distributions, ranges of likely outcomes based on observable trends and understood physics. By 2050, most coastal cities would be struggling with regular flooding or already abandoned. Agricultural patterns would have shifted dramatically, with former productive regions becoming uninhabitable and former marginal lands becoming valuable. Water stress would dominate geopolitics, with conflicts over rivers and aquifers becoming more common than conflicts over oil had been. By 2100, if emissions continued on their current trajectory, the planet would be committed to temperature increases that would make large portions of the tropics uninhabitable during summer months, that would trigger the collapse of major ice sheets and the loss of most coral reefs, that would force migration and adaptation on scales human civilization had never experienced. By 2200, the planetary system would be so different from what humans had evolved in, what we'd built our entire civilization around, that the word catastrophe would be inadequate. New equilibrium. Yes, the planet would find new stability. But that stability would be achieved only after immense loss of species, of ecosystems, of human life and human culture. And this wasn't speculation. This was physics. This was chemistry. This was the inevitable consequence of changing atmospheric composition at rates that geological history suggested led to mass extinction events. The Yeti knew this with the certainty of direct perception. His people had always known it, had felt the patterns shifting, had watched the thresholds approaching, had tried to warn anyone who would listen. No one had listened, and now it was too late to prevent the worst of what was coming. I am 83 years old now. My body is failing in the way bodies do at the end of long lives lived at high altitude. My joints ache constantly. My breathing is labored even at rest. I know I don't have much time left, which is why I'm finally speaking this secret fully, completely, without the protective ambiguity I've always wrapped it in before. 3 months ago, the Yeti showed me something he'd never shared before. The deepest secret, the most shocking truth, the understanding that explains everything about his people and about what's happening to our planet. His species doesn't just feel the planet's systems. They are conscious nodes within those systems. Their existence, their awareness, their neural activity, it's all entangled with planetary processes in ways that blur the line between observer and observed, between mind and matter, between consciousness and the physical systems consciousness emerges from. When I communicate with the Yeti, I'm not just exchanging information with an intelligent animal. I'm interfacing with a distributed consciousness that extends beyond his individual brain to include atmospheric patterns, hydrological cycles, the subtle electromagnetic fields generated by living systems interacting with geological processes. His people evolved not just to survive in the mountains, but to be part of the mountains' regulatory systems. They are living feedback mechanisms that helped maintain stability through their very existence, through their sensitivity to imbalance, through the ways their behavior and consciousness interfaced with larger patterns. This revelation about consciousness and climate will change everything you thought you knew. Subscribe now. What comes next about the connection between mind and planetary systems is absolutely shocking. And here's the part that will sound like madness to anyone who hasn't spent decades learning to perceive what the Yeti perceives. consciousness affects climate. Not metaphorically, not through the indirect mechanisms of human behavior and carbon emissions, but directly. The quality and character of consciousness present on the planet influences the stability and trajectory of physical systems. The Yeti showed me research that human scientists have only begun hinting at, studies on observer effects in quantum mechanics, on the role of information and consciousness in physical processes, on the ways that living systems seem to generate order and complexity that can't be fully explained by known physics. His people knew this intuitively, lived it daily. They were conscious beings whose presence helped organize and stabilize the systems they were part of. And as they died out, as that organizing presence was removed, the systems became more chaotic, more prone to extreme fluctuations, less stable. The climate crisis wasn't just about carbon and greenhouse gases. It was also about consciousness crisis. Humanity had not only changed the atmosphere's composition, we'd also changed the quality of consciousness present on the planet. We'd replaced sensitive, deeply embedded, systems-aware consciousness, like the Yetis, with abstract, disconnected, exploitative consciousness that saw nature as resource rather than relationship. And that shift in consciousness was affecting physical systems in ways that science hadn't yet developed the frameworks to measure or understand. The Yeti could feel it because he was part of it, because his consciousness was entangled with the systems in ways mine was only beginning to be. He showed me that this was why his teaching had focused on training me to perceive differently, to feel rather than just think, to develop the kind of systems-aware consciousness that his species possessed naturally. Because consciousness that could perceive the whole might influence the whole, might contribute to stability rather than chaos, might help the planet find pathways through the crisis that purely physical interventions couldn't access. It wasn't about reversing climate change, that ship had sailed, but it was about influencing how the transition unfolded, about helping the planet find the least catastrophic pathway through the transformation it was already committed to. The Yeti was the last of his kind, but he was training me to carry forward the kind of consciousness his species had embodied, to become a bridge between human understanding and the deeper planetary awareness that might help guide what was coming. After that revelation, our work together changed. No longer just sharing information, but actively training me to expand my consciousness in ways that would let me interface with planetary systems the way his people had always done. The practices were intense, sometimes dangerous, always pushing the boundaries of what human neurology seemed designed for. Hours of meditation in extreme cold, training my awareness to extend beyond my body's boundaries, learning to perceive energy flows and information patterns that normal human consciousness couldn't detect. The Yeti was patient but urgent. He was dying. I could feel it in our connection, could sense his life force slowly diminishing as his ancient body finally gave out. He had perhaps a year left, maybe two. And in that time, he needed to transfer as much as possible of what his species knew, what they'd learned over millions of years of evolution as conscious nodes in planetary systems. I learned to feel weather patterns before they arrived, not through prediction, but through direct perception of the atmospheric changes that preceded them. Learned to sense earthquake potential by feeling the stress building in geological structures. Learned to detect water sources underground by perceiving the electromagnetic signatures of flowing water. These weren't psychic powers or supernatural abilities. They were natural capacities that humans had lost or suppressed as we'd become more focused on abstract thinking and less grounded in direct sensory engagement with our environment. The Yeti was teaching me to recover those capacities, to become the kind of being whose consciousness could contribute to planetary stability rather than chaos. And he was teaching me the cost. because consciousness at that level of intensity and integration wasn't comfortable. It meant feeling the planet's pain directly, experiencing the destabilization as if it were happening in your own body, carrying the weight of awareness that most humans were protected from by the blessing of ignorance. I understood now why he always seemed sad, why his people had chosen retreat over proliferation, why they'd faded from the world rather than fighting to maintain their presence. Because feeling the planet this directly meant feeling its suffering, its struggle to maintain equilibrium in the face of accelerating disruption. It was unbearable knowledge made bearable only by the understanding that consciousness mattered, that awareness itself was a form of participation, that being present to the planet's transformation, really present, not just intellectually aware but experientially engaged, was itself a contribution to the larger process. I spent my days now in practices that looked like madness to anyone who observed them. Sitting motionless for hours in snow and wind, apparently doing nothing but actually training my awareness to merge with atmospheric patterns. Walking slowly through the landscape with eyes closed, learning to navigate by feeling the subtle energy signatures of terrain and vegetation. Lying on bare rock and earth, letting my consciousness extend downward into geological structures, feeling the slow movements and stresses that would eventually result in earthquakes and landslides. My remaining family thought I'd lost my mind. The village whispered that their shaman had finally succumbed to the madness that had been threatening him for decades. And maybe they were right, by their definition of sanity. Because what I was learning to do, what the Yeti was teaching me, required abandoning the comfortable boundaries that keep human consciousness safely separated from the overwhelming complexity of planetary systems. But it was necessary, because when he died, when the last being whose consciousness was naturally integrated with Earth systems finally ceased to exist, someone needed to carry forward that capacity. Someone needed to maintain the connection, however imperfectly, between human awareness and the larger patterns we were part of but had forgotten how to perceive. 2 weeks ago, the Yeti called me to a meeting at a place we'd never used before, a high valley accessible only through a dangerous climb, at an altitude where the air was so thin that I could barely function even after a lifetime of adaptation. He was there waiting, and I could see immediately that this was the end. His fur had gone completely white. His movements were slow, deliberate, each gesture requiring obvious effort. And his consciousness, the vast, deep awareness that I'd learned to merge with during our practices, was starting to fragment, to withdraw from the planetary connections it had maintained for so long. Through our link, he showed me what was coming, not just for him, but for the planet, for humanity, for the entire web of life that was now entering a period of unprecedented transformation. The next 30 years would be the critical transition period. Temperature increases were already locked in that would trigger feedback loops and tipping points that would cascade through the climate system. Ice sheet collapse, methane release from thawing permafrost, Amazon forest dieback, coral reef death. All of these were now inevitable within time frames measured in decades, not centuries. CTA, the final revelation about Earth's future, is more specific and more shocking than any scientific prediction. Don't miss what comes next. Subscribe and share this message. Humanity needs to hear what the Yeti knows. But, and this was crucial, within that inevitable transformation, there remained choice. Not choice about whether the changes would happen, but choice about how humanity responded. Choice about whether we adapted with wisdom and cooperation or with denial and conflict. Choice about whether we used the crisis to evolve our consciousness and our civilization, or whether we clung to the patterns that had created the crisis until they destroyed us. The Yeti showed me two futures branching from this moment. In the first future, humans continued the pattern we'd established. Denial until denial was impossible, then panic and chaos. Hoarding resources, building walls, treating climate migration as invasion rather than humanitarian crisis. Fighting over the scraps of the old world instead of cooperating to build something new. In this future, billions died needlessly, human civilization fragmented or collapsed, and the survivors emerged centuries later as traumatized remnants who'd lost most of our knowledge and culture. In the second future, humans chose differently. Recognized the crisis for what it was, not punishment but consequence, not end but transformation. Mobilized our remarkable capacity for cooperation and innovation toward adaptation rather than prevention. Built new social structures appropriate for the world we'd created rather than the world we'd lost. In this future, billions still suffered and many died, but the suffering had meaning. The deaths led somewhere. And what emerged on the other side was a humanity that had finally learned to live in conscious partnership with the planet that birthed us. The difference between these futures wasn't technology or resources or any external factor. It was consciousness. It was whether enough humans could learn to perceive the way the Yeti perceived, to feel the planet's reality rather than just think about it, to make decisions from systems awareness rather than from fear and greed and short-term self-interest. And that's why he'd spent decades training me. Not because I would save the world, no individual could do that, but because consciousness was contagious. Because one person perceiving clearly could help others learn to perceive clearly. Because the quality of awareness I carried would influence the people I encountered, would shift conversations and decisions in subtle ways, would contribute to the collective consciousness that would ultimately determine which future humanity manifested. He was passing the torch, from his dying species to mine, from the beings who'd naturally embodied planetary consciousness to the beings who'd forgotten it but could relearn it if we chose to, from the ancient watchers to the new guardians. If we could rise to that role, if we could transform from exploiters to partners, from unconscious to aware. His final teaching was this: the planet would survive. Life would persist. New equilibriums would emerge. But what humanity became through this crisis, whether we evolved or devolved, whether we grew wise or remained cleverly stupid, whether we learned to live as conscious participants in planetary systems or continued trying to dominate what we couldn't control, that was still undecided. And the decision would be made not through any single action or policy or technology, but through the aggregate of billions of individual choices, influenced by the quality of consciousness present in human culture, shaped by whether enough people could learn to feel the planet's reality rather than just believing comfortable stories about it. He had trained me to be a seed carrier, to hold and transmit the kind of consciousness that his species had embodied, adapted now for human neurology and human culture. To be a bridge between ways of knowing, between species, between the world as it was dying and the world as it might yet become. As the sun set over the high valley, as the temperature dropped toward lethal and the thin air grew even thinner, the Yeti did something he'd never done before. He pressed his forehead against mine, skin to skin, consciousness to consciousness, and for one eternal moment I felt everything he was, everything his species had been, everything they'd learned and carried and tried to preserve. It was overwhelming. It was unbearable. It was the most profound gift I'd ever received. Then he released me, stepped back, and spoke for the first and only time in our 56 years of relationship. His voice was rough and used, barely recognizable as vocalization. But the word was clear, was human language adapted to his vocal structure with obvious effort. Remember, that was all. That was everything. Then he turned and walked deeper into the valley, into terrain I couldn't follow, toward whatever place his people went to die. And I knew with absolute certainty that I would never see him again, that the last Yeti was choosing his ending in solitude and dignity, that an entire species' millions of years of existence were concluding in that moment. I sat in the snow and wept. For him, for his people, for the planet losing its conscious nodes, for humanity facing a crisis we'd created but didn't know how to resolve, for the beauty that was ending and the uncertainty of what would come after. But beneath the grief, there was also purpose, because he'd given me the tools, the training, the consciousness required to be what the planet needed now. Not a savior, those didn't exist, but a witness, a translator, a carrier of awareness that might help tip the balance toward the better future rather than the worse one. I am 83 years old. The Yeti is dead. I felt his consciousness wink out 3 days ago, felt the planet register the loss, felt the regulatory systems he'd been part of become slightly more unstable with his departure. I am now the only being on Earth who carries what his species knew, who perceives the way they perceived, who understands what's happening from both human and planetary perspectives. And I'm dying too. My heart is failing, my lungs are giving out, my body is shutting down system by system. I have weeks, maybe days, which is why I'm speaking this testimony now, writing down what can be written, trying to translate into words what I've learned through decades of consciousness-to-consciousness communication with the last Yeti. The secret about climate that will shock you isn't about carbon parts per million or temperature increases or any of the numbers that scientists track. Those are real and important, but they're symptoms, not causes, effects, not roots. The secret is this: the planet is conscious. Not in the way humans are conscious, not with a single unified awareness or a sense of self, but conscious as a vast, distributed intelligence that emerges from the interaction of billions of living systems, geological processes, atmospheric dynamics, and yes, the quality of awareness present within it. The Yeti's people were part of that planetary consciousness. They were nodes in a distributed intelligence network that helped regulate climate, maintain equilibrium, process information about system states, and respond with corrective actions that manifested through behavior and presence rather than through technology or intervention. As they died out, as that conscious network was dismantled by human expansion and human violence and human obliviousness, the planet's self-regulatory capacity diminished. And the climate crisis we're experiencing is partly, not entirely, but significantly, a consequence of that loss of consciousness, that removal of aware presence that had helped maintain stability for millions of years. But here's the crucial part. The reason this isn't a message of despair. Human consciousness can fill that role. We have the neural capacity, the awareness potential, the ability to extend our perception beyond our individual bodies into the larger systems we're part of. We've just forgotten how, have trained ourselves into a narrow, abstract, disconnected way of thinking that cuts us off from direct participation in planetary processes. The Yeti taught me to remember, taught me to perceive the way his people perceived. And that perceiving isn't magic or mysticism or anything supernatural. It's natural human capacity that we've suppressed, that we can recover, that we desperately need to recover if we want to navigate the crisis we've created. When you learn to feel the planet's systems directly, when you extend your awareness beyond the boundaries of your skin into the larger patterns you're embedded in, you don't need scientists to tell you the climate is destabilizing. You feel it. You know it with the same certainty you know when your own body is sick. And knowing it that directly, feeling it that intimately, changes how you act. You can't maintain the disconnection that allows exploitation and denial. You can't continue treating the planet as resource rather than relationship. You become naturally, inevitably aligned with planetary well-being because you're experiencing yourself as part of the planet rather than separate from it. This is what the Yeti tried to teach humanity for generations. This is what shamans and mystics and indigenous peoples have been saying for centuries. This is what science is only now beginning to hint at with research on extended cognition and embodied consciousness, and the ways that living systems display characteristics of intelligence and awareness. We are not separate from the planet. Our consciousness is not contained within our skulls. We are nodes in a planetary intelligence network, and the quality of awareness we embody either contributes to stability or to chaos, either helps the system find balance or pushes it toward breakdown. The climate crisis is real. The physical changes are locked in. The next decades will be catastrophic by any historical standard. Billions will suffer. Many will die. Human civilization as currently organized will not survive intact. But within that inevitable transformation, there is still choice. There is still agency. There is still the possibility that enough humans might learn to perceive clearly, might recover the conscious connection to planetary systems that we've lost, might become the guardian species we have the capacity to be rather than the destructive force we've been. The Yeti is gone. His people are extinct. But what they knew, what they embodied, what they tried to teach, that lives on in me, and now in you, in anyone who reads these words and allows them to change how you perceive, how you think, how you relate to the living planet you're part of. Don't have much time left. Soon I'll join the Yeti in whatever comes after consciousness ceases. But before I go, I'm planting these seeds, sharing this understanding, offering this transmission of awareness that might help humanity navigate the crisis ahead with wisdom instead of panic, with cooperation instead of conflict, with expanded consciousness instead of the narrow self-interest that created this catastrophe. You can dismiss this as the delusions of an old shaman, the mystical ravings of someone who spent too long at high altitude. That's understandable. That's how human culture has trained you to respond to claims that challenge materialist assumptions about consciousness and reality. But before you dismiss it, try this. Sit quietly. Close your eyes. Feel your breath. Then let your awareness expand beyond your body. Feel the air moving around you. Feel the ground beneath you. Feel the larger patterns, weather, seasons, the slow turning of the planet beneath your feet. You don't have to believe anything. Just feel. Just perceive. Just notice what's there when you stop thinking about the world and start experiencing it directly. That's the beginning. That's the doorway into the kind of consciousness the Yeti embodied. The kind of awareness that might help humanity find the better path through the crisis we've created. The planet is conscious. You are part of that consciousness. And what you choose to do with your awareness, whether you use it to perceive clearly and act wisely, or whether you maintain the disconnection and denial that feels safer but leads nowhere good, that matters more than you can imagine. The Yeti's final word to me was remember. So I'm remembering, and I'm asking you to remember too. Remember that you're not separate from nature, but part of it. Remember that consciousness extends beyond your skull into the larger systems you're embedded in. Remember that perception can be trained, that awareness can be expanded, that you have capacities you've never used because culture taught you they were impossible or useless or crazy. Remember, perceive, feel, expand, connect. The planet needs conscious humans the way it once had conscious Yetis. We can't replace what was lost, but we can become something new, something that serves the same function in different form, aware presence that contributes to stability rather than chaos, conscious nodes in a planetary intelligence network that helps guide what's coming. This is the secret. This is the teaching. This is what the mountain shaman learned from decades of communion with the last Yeti, and what I'm passing to you now in my final days. Use it, embody it, share it, become it. The future depends not on technology or policy or any external intervention, but on the quality of consciousness present in human culture. On whether enough people can learn to perceive the reality we're part of rather than the comfortable stories we tell ourselves. The Yeti is gone, but his teaching lives on. Remember, this is more than a story. It's a transmission of consciousness itself, a teaching from the last Yeti filtered through the last shaman who could hear him. If these words resonated at a level deeper than intellect, if you felt something shift in your awareness as you read, then you've already begun the transformation. Subscribe to this channel and share this message as widely as possible, not for views or likes, but because humanity desperately needs this understanding. The climate crisis isn't just about carbon and temperature. It's about consciousness and connection, about whether we can evolve fast enough to survive the changes we've created. The Yeti tried to warn us for generations. The shaman carried that warning through his entire life. Now it's our turn, our choice, our responsibility. Learn to feel the planet. Expand your awareness. Recover the conscious connection we've lost. Become the guardian species we have the capacity to be. The planet is waiting. The future is undecided. And your consciousness, your awareness, your perception, your choice to see clearly, matters more than you can possibly imagine. This is the Yeti's final teaching. This is the shaman's last testimony. This is humanity's remaining opportunity to choose wisdom over cleverness, connection over separation, conscious participation over unconscious destruction. The clock is ticking. The transformation has begun. How we navigate it depends on whether enough of us can learn to perceive the way the Yeti perceived. Share this message. Practice the awareness. Remember what we've forgotten. The planet is conscious, and so are you. Act accordingly. Tenzing Norbu, shaman of the Khumbu Valley, died peacefully in his sleep on the night of December 21st, 2024, at the age of 83. His body was found by villagers who had come to check on him after 3 days of silence. Beside his body was this manuscript, written in English and Nepali, his final attempt to translate into words what he had learned through decades of communion with the being he called teacher, guardian, and friend. His last words, according to witnesses, were spoken in a language no one recognized. But the feeling those words carried, urgency mixed with peace, warning mixed with hope, was unmistakable to everyone who heard them. The village elder said it sounded like the mountain itself was speaking through him, like the voice of something ancient and vast and deeply concerned with humanity's future. Perhaps it was. Perhaps the Yeti's consciousness, no longer bound to physical form, found one final way to speak through the human who had learned to hear him. Or perhaps it was just an old shaman's dying breath, meaningless syllables from a failing brain. You decide. But as you decide, pay attention to what you feel, to what you know beyond thought, to the awareness that exists before language shapes it into concepts and beliefs. That's where the truth lives. That's where the Yeti's teaching continues. That's where your own consciousness can expand into the planetary awareness we desperately need. The mountain remembers. The shaman remembered. Now it's our turn to remember. And in that remembering, perhaps we'll find the wisdom to navigate what's coming with grace instead of panic, with cooperation instead of conflict, with consciousness instead of the desperate cleverness that created this crisis. The teaching is complete. The transmission is offered. What you do with it is up to you. Choose wisely. Time is short. The planet is watching. And somewhere in the high places where the last Yeti lived and died, his consciousness may yet linger, hoping that humanity will finally learn to listen to perceive, to become the aware presence that could tip the balance towards survival instead of collapse. Remember, always remember,